Okay. Okay, so for this roundtable on Dickens and Contagion, we have a series of passages from Dickens and a series of speakers who are going to talk about them. And I've got some prompt questions. And in this roundtable, we have Pamela K. Gilbert, who is Albert Brick Professor of English at the University of Florida. She's published widely in the areas of Victorian literature, popular culture, the body, and the history of medicine. Her most recent book is Victorian Skin, Surface Self-History, from Cornell University Press. Other books include Disease, Desire and the Body in Victorian Women's Popular Novels, Mapping the Victorian Social Body, The Citizen's Body, and Cholera and the Nation. Sean Grass is Professor of English at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where he researches and teaches Dickens, the Victorian novel, and broader aspects of Victorian literature and culture. He's the author of 3 books, most recently The Commodification of Identity in Victorian Narrative, Autobiography, Sensation, and the Literary Marketplace, which was recently published by Cambridge University Press, and numerous articles on Dickens, Wilkie Collins, Charles Reade, and other writers. He's also Vice President of the Dickens Society and the Executive Secretary of the North American Victorian Studies Association. Eric G. Lorentzen is Professor of English at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he teaches a wide variety of courses, but specializes in 19th century British literature and culture, cultural studies and critical pedagogy, Charles Dickens and the Brontes. He's given more than 20 scholarly talks on Dickens and has multiple publications on Boz, with the most recent, The Schoolroom is a Nation, Subverting the Catechistic Methods in Dickens, appearing in Dickens Studies Annual. His research interests include the rise of mass literacy and dangerous modes of education in the 19th century British novel, cultural studies methodologies in the university literature classroom, and critical interdisciplinary pedagogy. He's currently working on a book-length project about the 19th century educational praxis known as the catechistic method. Natalie McKnight is a professor of humanities and dean of the College of General Studies at Boston University. She's published several books and numerous articles on Victorian fiction, including Idiots, Madmen, and Other Prisoners in Dickens, Suffering Mothers in Mid-Victorian Novels, and Fathers in Victorian Fiction. She's co-editor of Dickens Studies Annual and the current president of the Dickens Society. We've got a couple more speakers. It's a star-studded panel, so we're very pleased to have everybody here. Lillian Nayder is Professor of English and Chair of the Humanities Division at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, where she teaches courses on 19th century British fiction. Her books include Wilkie Collins, Unequal Partners, Charles Dickens, Wilkie Collins, and Victorian Authorship, and The Other Dickens, A Life of Catherine Hogarth. Pete Orford is course director of the MA in Charles Dickens Studies at the University of Buckingham and the Charles Dickens Museum, London. He's currently editing Pictures from Italy for Oxford University Press and preparing a biography for the forthcoming Literary Lives series by Blackwell. His most recent publication was The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Charles Dickens's unfinished novel, and our attempts to end it. So the first passage that we've got, and I'll read excerpts from the passage and then open up the prompt question. Much mighty speech-making there has been, both in and out of Parliament, concerning Tom, and much wrathful disputation how Tom shall be got right, whether he shall be put into the main road by constables or by beadles, or by bell-ringing, or by force of figures, or by correct principles of taste, or by high church, or by low church, or by no church, whether he shall be set to splitting trusses of polemical straws with the crooked knife of his mind, or whether he shall be put to stone-breaking instead. In the midst of which dust and noise there is but one thing perfectly clear, to wit, that Tom only may and can, or shall and will, be reclaimed according to somebody's theory but nobody's practice. And in the hopeful meantime, Tom goes to perdition head foremost in his old determined spirit. But he has his revenge. Even the winds are his messengers, and they serve him in these hours of darkness. There is not a drop of Tom's corrupted blood, but propagates infection and contagion somewhere. And I won't read the rest of it. But hopefully, as you can see, this passage places issues of class, poverty, moral environmentalism, political responsibility, the relations of the poor to privileged, and of the home to the larger world in the context of disease and contagion. So the question that we're putting to the roundtable is, what does it suggest about the relationship of empire to nation?
Okay, who wants to speak first on this one then, in our roundtable? Was this Lillian's passage? I think it may. Okay.
I'm not sure whose it was, but
Yep.
in the second paragraph, which Emily didn't actually read, it's clear that Dickens is contextualizing this situation in terms of empire. So Pete, did you want to speak to that?
Apparently so. Yeah, thanks, Lillian. Cheers. Just drop me in here. Why not? Okay. Hello, everybody. Okay. So, I mean, obviously, what we have here is throughout Bleak House, this idea of contagion and responsibility for contagion as well, of who is responsible and how much, in this sense, the person with the illness here, the contagious person, is seen to be a criminal as much as a victim here, and the lack of sympathy for them, and the simple moving on, the famous moving on of Joe as well, to try to pass on the problem rather than actually addressing the problem too. I think is obviously much more interesting to read in light of current events and how we think about the responses of our own governments towards the issues of COVID-19 and how we are or are not effectively dealing with this. I think this is a passage that we will never quite read in the same way again after the light of current events. What do you think, Lillian?
Well, I think part of the point seems to be that we and Dickens and his contemporaries haven't focused on the right things.
Yeah.
So in terms of where the sort of political energy has gone, it's gone to the wrong places.
Agreed. I think there's also that sense of, with the focus on lockdown recently as well, a lot of it is about the show of stopping contagion rather than actually stopping contagion. Are we being seen to act? Are we doing something that is seen to be effective? Can we now reopen everything and carry on and show ourselves to be strong, rather than actually acknowledging the problem and dealing with that in a more sympathetic way that perhaps allows a recognition of weakness. You know, we have these sick people who need help there as well, but would actually rectify it, but will also therefore involve an admission of fault in doing so as well.
It's one of the things that the novel can do that real life can't, though, isn't it? In the sense that for the novel, the disease does operate in a closed system. I mean, this is, you know, the quote that I submitted is probably on a subsequent slide, but you know, the reader can read the novel without having to fear that she or he is going to become contaminated, right? Yeah. I mean, so there's this illustration in the book of all of the connectedness of people across social class, across you know, across gender lines, across, you know, but Alan Woodcourt travels abroad and he doesn't come back with a fever. Joe travels to a bunch of, you know, is sort of the intermediary vector sort of figure through much of the book, but he doesn't encounter everybody. I mean, you know, there's a sense in which sequestration and these prohibitions on travel, lockdown, whatever you want to call it, function just fine in the novel by and large, but they don't seem to work very well in real life.
That's true. And I suppose the injustice of the novel is that it's Esther who falls ill. You know, Esther, the one who cares for Joe and actually makes an effort, is the one who then gets ill. There's a warning there of look what happens when you help. You know, whereas Skimpole, you know, or Talkingcorn do not at any point get ill. So in a way, if we were to rewrite Bleak House now, I think we'd probably make that more of a leveling pandemic where everyone, you know, or more people contract the illness. But there is, for all of Dickens's moralizing on it and trying to show the plight of the poor, unintentionally, he's actually in a way reinforcing that message of beware the poor, beware helping the poor, because if you do help, like Esther does, you are involved in that contamination. And that's what you can possibly get as a result.
The leveling here might take place in terms of the revenge and the connection to the sort of contamination from colonial places. Woodcourt doesn't get ill, but he does suffer quite a shipwreck, and his absence contributes to the fact that his patients, like Esther and Miss Flight, and we can see by contrast when he comes back, Caddy Jellyby, do suffer because of his absence. In that second paragraph, we've got all these words that sort of describe physical disease, you know, corrupted, infection, contagion, pollute, pestilential gas. But we've also got these words that describe much more a sort of social disease, right? Obscenity, degradation, ignorance, wickedness, brutality. So the way he does connect those two things, I think, is really interesting.
You have moral environmentalism mapped onto physical contamination, which is, very typical for the period. One thing that interests me about this is that there's that strain of kind of Little Englandism, for lack of a better term, throughout the book, right? Like, don't look at Africa, look locally. It would be better to do something about the slums in London than to be concerned about the sun never setting on the British Empire. And yet, the representative of health and kindness and all of the good virtues is someone who does go and get brown and sunburned and healthy abroad, learning about these things. So there's a little bit of tension there.
Mhm.
There's also something strangely inclusive about the virus as well. I mean, Bleak House is all about connections and networks, isn't it? And it starts famously with a fog around London, which is both, to be despised, but also as a way of connecting all these characters together. So also with the smallpox going around, there's a sense where it identifies a group there as well. So it's that double legends of let's say the Little Englander sense of this is, we are dealing with this over here, and not really thinking about the global stage and what about those beyond. Let's focus on our own problems and come together for that, which does not translate to the modern day world and a more international outlook on how we deal with things like pandemics as well.
I'm wondering
One
if
of the things,
sorry.
I was just going to say, one of the things that complicates the connection, though, is that while Esther does get ill from helping out, she doesn't die, and clearly you see, even though it sounds like the disease is pretty democratic, of course it isn't. The people who suffer most from it are the poorest, just as is the case right now with COVID-19.
I wonder if people want to say more about Esther's suffering. I mean, the fact that, the opening sections of Bleak House seem to emphasize that she's being treated unfairly when her aunt suggests that she deserves to be punished. And yet, through the contagion she picks up from Joe, and Charlie is involved too, she is punished. And with the theme of disease and contagion as retribution, it does seem to raise the question of whether Dickens is suggesting that on some level she deserves to be punished after all. I'm just wondering what others on the panel think of that.
Picking up on that, I'll just move us over to passage 2, because that's what this is about, isn't it? It's Esther's illness. I lay through several ill weeks, and the usual tenor of my life became like an old remembrance, but it was not this effect of time so much as of the change in all my habits made by the helplessness and inaction of a sick room. So I thought it might be good to have this passage up and think about some of these questions that we'd proposed in terms of that separation and confinement, which is effective, and she does get better, as has been mentioned, and the tensions between these personal connections and separation, and what's at stake in social distancing.
I think what's so remarkable is the way that Esther does so forcibly social distance. The way that she does not allow Ada to come into the room at all, and she's insistent upon this of keeping people apart. So even at that moment, she's being typically Esther, typically selfless as well, and that sense of what she's trying to do. I mean, just thinking of what was being said about moral contagion as well. The fact that that Esther is seen as a blight upon her mother. And this concern of moral contagion, that you could pick something up from her as a consequence, and her own shame that comes from that worry of it as well. It always strikes me so unfair that Esther is the one who is marked by smallpox. I mean, usually the narrative would be you'd have a vain character who would go through that sort of transformation of being disfigured and then become a better person for it.